Michael with United Veterans Worldwide, excited today to meet with my friend John. John and I have been in contact now for probably about a month. John and I were introduced through John's brother, Jeremy, who is a really good friend of mine, and he and I have been through some pretty tough times with him as a family as he suffered the loss of his son due to a very rare cancer. And it took his life within about a year, and our whole community kind of gathered around Jeremy's family. We love them, we support them, and that loss was heavy for all of us, including John, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today. But John, this is really about you today and the story of your journey as a naval officer and all that's gone on with your experiences. And so maybe we can start there and have you introduce yourself, and we'll go back in time a little bit and talk through some of that chronology.
Okay, yeah, so my name is John Ward, and I retired from the Navy a couple of years ago. I was a naval officer for almost 24 years, focused in submarines, and worked with Navy reservists for the last dozen or so years of my career. My family and I lived a lot of different locations, kind of the standard military experience. I guess I could count them up, way over a dozen locations, which had its highs and lows. We tried to really focus on the good aspects of all the different experiences, the different places we lived, but there's challenges for us. So I had a good experience, and now on to something completely different, I guess you could say. So should I just go back to the beginning?
Yeah, let's take it back in time a little bit. Maybe tell us why you went into the military service, why you chose the Navy, and where that's taken you, some highs and some lows.
Okay, so I grew up in Idaho, and where I lived, nobody was really interested in the military. At least I didn't think so. I had a classmate that went to the Naval Academy, and we were all confused. Why would you do that? And I don't know if it planted a seed, but it just kind of said, okay, there's something going on here. But where I started considering the military was I was a missionary in Finland in the mid-90s for a couple of years. And in Finland, even to this day, they have mandatory military service. And I was intrigued with that. As I met more people all around the different parts of the country, I perceived that there was a level of patriotism in these Finns that I admired. And I drew a connection between their military service and their patriotism. It wasn't shooting fireworks, waving flags. It was deep in their soul. And so I still didn't really think about joining the military, but Bax was going to college, and I could see these ads for the National Guard. And every once in a while, I'd see people cruising around campus or whatever, wearing their fatigues. And I got a feeling I should look at joining the military. And it was pretty surprising. And that was, my wife would probably say that was not part of the pre-wedding interview, because we didn't just, it wasn't on my mind when we got married. And then so I looked into the Guard. My dad had been a Marine. And decided I didn't want to go be in tanks and stuff like that. And so I ended up looking into the Navy, and they had a nuclear power program. And that was I was a year away or so from graduating with an engineering degree. And so I joined the Navy nuclear power program. And so that's kind of how I started. And then I just went to Officer Candidate School.
If I can interrupt you, John, for our global audience who doesn't know, the only people who are allowed to enter that nuclear program, because I'm really familiar with it, is the top really 1 or 2% of those who scored high academically on these standardized tests, that really showed proficiency and quickness in intelligence. So were you at Charleston?
And they let me in anyway, I guess I could say. So yeah, we lived in Charleston, South Carolina. Well, I'm just right outside of there for a year.
What year?
I thought 2000, 2001, actually. The beginning of 2001 is when I started. So we were there pretty much all of 2001 for 6 months of power school and 6 months for a different training.
Because we were there as well, and I worked at the hospital in Charleston as a corpsman in 2000 and it would have been 2000 and maybe it was 2004, 5, and 6. I was there.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. My daughter was born when we lived there. Actually, we did go to the Naval Hospital, but she was born out in town in North Charleston for some reason. So, yeah.
Well, keep going from there.
So we went through that pipeline and ultimately ended up on the USS Michigan over west of Seattle, and I was stationed there on USS Michigan for 3 years. I remember talking to my recruiter about what you do on a submarine, and he just kept talking and talking, and I was like, okay, so you're busy. Okay, got it. There's not a lot of downtime. And as I recall, he said that he and his wife had twins while he was out at sea. He was out at sea when his twins were born. That's how I remember it. And actually, my third child, he was born while I was at sea. And so that was interesting. I knew it was a possibility. And actually, our fourth child, our last child, she was born while I was on board, but I was actually there with my wife at Naval Hospital in Bremerton, Washington, when she was born. So submarine life was tough. It was very demanding. Very different environment from, I guess, how I was raised. But there was a lot of professional accomplishment, or a lot of professional pride, I guess, in what we were doing. Something about being in the military and taking a warship out to sea. There's something you really can't explain about doing something like that. And I guess you've done similar work. Have you been out?
Have I been out to sea?
Did you go out to sea?
No. I unfortunately stayed mostly on solid ground. Spent some time with the Marines at Pendleton doing trainings and things, but no, never deployed in the Navy in that capacity.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of how it started, and yeah.
Well, it can't be understated how challenging it is to go through that type of training, because if I remember correctly, the guys that I knew really well who were going through that school system, they were constantly busy, whether they were studying or they were on watch, on duty. It was constant bang, bang. And then once they got to the fleet, it was a high, fast tempo of 6 months to 8 months at sea or whatever, back for a couple of months, back out for training, back in, back out for deployment, back out. And it just never stopped. I mean, the military would, the government would throw money at you guys like crazy and say, stay in, we want you to keep going, because you were so highly sought after. And I remember one story, if I might share real quick. In boot camp, I was called as a section leader in boot camp, and that really just meant I needed to make sure that myself and a couple other people had their racks, their bunks made really tight, and all their clothes stored properly in the right place. And I had one kid who was my bunkmate, and he was going to nuke power school. Super smart kid, but zero common sense. And this dude drove me absolutely nuts. And I ended up getting in trouble because I didn't make his bed for him because he was going too slow. And I ended up getting kicked out of being a section leader right at the very end before I would have gotten an award or something. And I've never forgotten that lesson, which was, we're all different. We have different skill sets. And we always need to pull as a team. If your teammate's dropping the ball a little bit, you gotta pick up the slack. And it came in handy later on that lesson, but that was a tough one for me to learn younger in boot camp.
Yeah, for sure. Sure, that's funny. So you have have a good taste in your mouth for Navy nukes. That's good to know. That's funny. So yeah, I guess from there we went to shore duty, Virginia, and that was an interesting experience. Worked on some cool projects while we were stationed over there, and then I actually got out of the Navy. There were a lot of things I appreciated about the Navy, but at that point I was not willing to spend basically my children's childhood at sea, and I had an option. So, like you mentioned, the Navy incentivizes people to stay in as Navy nukes with a lot of money, but it just wasn't worth it to me. So I left the Navy, and ultimately I ended up joining the Navy Reserve. I wasn't intending to, and through the Navy Reserve, I ended up coming back to active duty, but I wasn't going out to sea. I did go out to sea a few times, but I was never on board a ship as a crew member. And getting a submarine or a ship when you're not a crew member is completely different from the stress of being a crew member, just the unrelenting pressure. But it was a good experience. We moved to Hawaii. We'd been living in Kentucky and had some really crazy winters. And so when I floated the idea to my wife, she was very ready to move to a sunny place that was nice and warm with beaches and all those things. So that was kind of the next step. And from there, we moved to a handful of different places and had a lot of different kinds of adventures. It was kind of interesting because there were still difficulties. We had people on our street in Hawaii that were in the Army. And this was really when people were going to Afghanistan a lot. People that were doing exactly what I was doing, reserve management in the submarine force, they were getting sent to some of those places. And I know in the Army, this guy that lived across the street, his career path was basically, he was going to one of those places, and he'll be back for a little while, and he was going back. And I can't remember how many deployments he had done, but I feel like it was on the order of 5 or something. And for the next several years of his career, that's what his career was going to be. And how was his family going to cope with that? So something we definitely thought a lot about was the challenges that they experienced. So.
Yeah, and one of the biggest, and you know it for yourself too, is the pre-deployment workup and the stress on family, on marriage beforehand, and then the reintegration afterwards becomes a real challenge as well. And I just interviewed a good friend of mine just the other day, Nathan, and he deployed back to back 4 to 5 times in a short period of time, never fully recovering from the first combat experience, going right into the next, and it just was not healthy for us to push that hard. In hindsight, I wish that there was a better strategy at the top level that would have included the damage that would be done to soldiers, airmen, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, who were deploying all the time. We never really thought about the mental health aspect or the physical aspect, because guys were getting wounded and still going back. And it took its toll on all of us who served during that global war on terrorism.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I talked about was my last couple of, talking about my last tour in the Navy was here in Utah, which confuses people. There's Navy reservists all over. And so my role was to be the commanding officer over the Navy Reserve Center. So we had on staff duty on the order of about 20 people. And Navy reservists, we had, I think, 400 to 500 sailors that lived mostly a lot in eastern Idaho, some in Wyoming, and then a few others that lived far away. And they would travel in, and we would make sure they were ready to do what they needed to do. And that was experience. It's kind of fun working with Navy reservists that have a day job and a little bit of a different expertise. A lot of them they skew a little bit old because Navy reservists sometimes join later instead of maybe 18 or 21 or something like that. They might join when they're 25 or even in their 30s. And so this different, I don't know if maturity is really the right word, but you have a different outlook on and different exposures. And there was a lot of value there, and it was a cool experience. What was kind of peculiar as I met more people as they were leaving their career, one of the things is that lots of times people have a really great career, and then the last thing that happens in their career is something kind of negative, and maybe they don't sync well with their boss, and then it becomes clear that they're not going to get promoted anymore, and really it's just better for you to fade away. Thanks for your service. Here's a flag maybe, and good luck with the next step of your life. And I saw that happen with people I worked with. I feel like that kind of happened with me. Not really woe is me. It's kind of the nature of how the Navy is. And I felt like it was really disappointing and an unnecessary way to end somebody's career. I'm not really sure if I'm expressing myself very clearly, but the idea being that, the last taste of your experience in the Navy is really kind of a negative one. Thanks for all your decades of work for us, but off you go. And so one of the things that Jeremy actually introduced, my brother that you introduced at the beginning, introduced me to was this idea of the grief recovery method. He introduced me to this book called the When Children Grieve. And it's for adults, parents, counselors, anybody that works with children, to really be able to connect with them on an emotional level and help them cope with the losses in their lives. And so Jeremy, before actually his son died, JJ told him, "Hey, Dad, you have to promise me that you and the girls will grief counseling." He didn't really know the words, but he just said it. He was worried about his family because he knew that the end was coming very soon. And I got right to be thinking about his family at this moment right before he was going to be leaving this earth. And so Jeremy found out some information. And so he's the one that introduced me to the grief recovery process. And so my wife and I have spent the last years of our lives really thinking a lot about grief recovery, which is kind of counterintuitive. Like, what do you mean you talk about grief? Well, I guess maybe another way to think about it is we talk about emotional healing. The reality is grief is universal, something we all experience. And sometimes we feel like, well, I'm just going to push through it. In the military, I feel like we really press forward through grief. Not that we need to wallow in it and feel its effects throughout our lives, but if we can process that grief effectively, then we are going to be bogged down. And I think, the story you mentioned about your friend that just got deployed back to back to back to back, there is emotional baggage, you could say, from all those previous ones. And if you don't process that, it is going to affect you moving forward. So those are some of the things that we think a lot about.
Yeah, and if I go back a little bit, John, on your story of the Navy, you served during a time when COVID was hitting. And I recently interviewed my friend Jared, who was a Marine Corps officer located out of, I think, Lejeune on the East Coast. And he expressed the challenge of the politicized Navy, Marine Corps that were pushing down mandates that said either you get vaccinated or we kick these good Marines and good sailors out, because they didn't follow this order. And he was really torn emotionally because of this as a leader of his men, and knew the caliber of these people. He himself was a collegiate wrestler, went on to wrestle for the Marines and for the Navy. Um, an incredible athlete today. He's a world champion jiu-jitsu fighter, warrior. And he attributes that time frame as a very traumatic experience for him, to be encouraged to force his Marines to be forced out based on that mandate. And I know that you have a little bit of experience with that as well. And would you mind walking us through your experience there?
Yeah, COVID, I think, in my opinion, I think COVID is the largest mass grief-inducing experience in recent history. Frankly, I think it's bigger than 9/11, not to downplay 9/11, of course, but just the profound effects of that were, it's hard to describe. For so many different reasons, I completely agree with what I'm hearing here, that the mandates and the policies from the Navy around COVID were, in my opinion, irrational. I thought they were cruel and they were counterproductive. I worked at that time living in Virginia Beach, and I was working at that time at a command with mostly civilians, probably 90% civilians. And these civilians were relatively senior. I would say the average age was in the 50s. People, there were some in the 40s, a good number in their 60s. And not to disparage anybody, but they weren't exactly the most fit people. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And these people could do anything that the state of Virginia or neighboring states would allow them to do. Like, they could go on trips, they could go anywhere that the state would allow them to go. However, our sailors that were 25 years old, that were passing all of their medical readiness and their physical readiness standards, they could do nothing. My older son, my oldest, he had returned from his mission, but he had only been home for a week or something, and he left to go to college out of state. And so we hadn't really seen him for a couple of years. And then he came back from COVID, and he and my other son, they wanted to go down to the Outer Banks and go camping, which was just out of some magic radius that I could not go with them. And I wanted to go out to I told my boss, who was a wonderful woman, civilian, a lot of respect for her. I want to take a little bit of leave. We're going to go rent an Airbnb or a cabin or whatever out on the Appalachians and spend a week out there. And she said, look, I can route this up for approval, but the reality is it's going to get disapproved. These things are not getting approved. And I said, that makes no sense. I'm living with all of those people that I would be living with. And the only thing I would be doing is getting gas and not going in and talking to anybody. I mean, it made no sense. It made absolutely no sense. And this just piled on and piled on. And that really weighed on me really heavily. You mentioned that your colleague, he was a leader. So we moved out here to Utah, and I was the commanding officer, and mandate rolled down that everybody had to get the COVID shots. And I ended up being the one that had to sign the letters, administratively separating, kicking out a whole bunch of sailors because they weren't ready to receive these shots. No matter if they had COVID before, it didn't matter. It really didn't matter. There was no excuse that was good enough. And I thought long and hard about it. But in the end, I could refuse to do this. I would be relieved of command. I was worried about whether my pension would be put at risk. And in the end, every single sailor would be kicked out anyway. It wasn't going to do anything for them. And so I decided to just sign the paper. And so actually it was crazy. One of these sailors, we went to church with him in Virginia. And so I see his name and I still think about him sometimes because these were good sailors. These were good people, and they had a concern, and that concern was not allowed to be voiced really at all. So yeah, I've actually done a lot of grief work about COVID, about the Navy's policy about COVID. And so I guess I used to have a lot of heat about it, a lot of emotional energy, and I still do, but it's actually, I guess the emotional heat is a lot less. but I haven't forgotten the facts around it. So that was my experience there. The thing that weighed on me more was the extremism stand down. I don't know if there was anything you wanted to talk about with COVID, though.
No, keep going. Yeah.
So soon after Biden was sworn in as president, after he was inaugurated, the Secretary of Defense instituted this extremism stand down. I don't know if you're very familiar with that.
I'm not.
So the extremism stand down, this was in response to some of the things that happened like on January 6th and things like that. And there were a handful, I don't really know the details, but I think there were a handful of service members, maybe one or two active duty, I really don't know, that were involved in the protests. I don't know if any of them went in the Capitol. I really don't know details. But apparently there was a concern that there was a lot of extremism in the military. And so as a result, we had to have this force-wide, like across the entire military, active and reserve, every single person had to go through this extremism stand down. This PowerPoint was created that we basically had to go through to some extent. And this was the most difficult, and I had to lead it because I was a commanding officer. And so fortunately, I had a little bit of time. Like I had to be done by this certain date, and that was a few weeks. So I had to wrestle with how was I going to deliver this training in a way that was emotionally honest to me, and true to my what I believed. And what really weighed on me was this stand down called into question. It questioned the patriotism and loyalty of our military. These are all volunteer. In the U.S. military, it's all volunteer. We don't have a draft. Every single person voluntarily joined the military. They wear the uniform. They elected to leave hometowns, to leave family, to leave friends, to be willing to and ready to go into harm's way. And their patriotism and loyalty is being questioned. It was beyond, I couldn't believe that our new commander-in-chief and our new Secretary of Defense decided that that was a good idea. And we delivered the training, and I was afraid, and I expressed this to my sailors, said, I'm not trying to convert you to my way of feeling or anything like that. But my biggest concern is that as a result of this, we're going to start looking at each other differently. We're going to start wondering, are you an extremist? Are you a racist? Are you going to undermine me? Because whether you're at a shore facility or you're out at sea, you have to trust each other. We trust each other with our lives, no joke. And I thought this was undermining our trust. And so I felt like in my opinion, there's never been a reckoning for that extremism stand down. And I just think it gets completely swept under the rug. It's no big deal that we question the loyalty of every single service member. And in the end, a year or two later, there was a report released, I don't know if it was by the Pentagon, I think it was. They said, it turns out extremism is not a problem in our military. There's pockets here and there. And we all knew that. Every single person knew that. And we talked about it internally. It's like, in my almost 24 years, I can't remember ever a single time, never did I witness anything extreme. I don't even really think I heard anything racist. I mean, it's possible, but if it was, that was like early. And people were just like, we're just here to work. We're just here to have a good time, support each other as sailors, and that's it. So that's actually where I still need to do some emotional work on that, because I still get really, really upset about that from time to time.
Well, now I might need to do some work, because that just gets me heated. Oh my gosh. Two things, John. First, the experiences you've shared as being a commanding officer and having these tough things. These weren't decisions that you had to make, and I'll put it like that, because I know as an officer, as a commander, we don't get to make some of those decisions. Those things are told to us, and we follow the order and we move out. In combat, I'm told to go and clear these buildings. I don't get to decide whether to clear those buildings. I get to decide who goes in first or whatever, but no, we still go through and we do the work. So in that sense, I hope you harbor no guilt or shame in what you had to do. It was an order. Secondly, the military has always been throughout history the great equalizer. If you look at the rough time racially during the 60s, it was a time of protest, of getting rights, more rights for people of color and women. All of these things were good movements. When Vietnam hit and people were drafted, we had every race involved in those combat, and it was the great equalizer. Those people had to look at each other as brothers and go and fight and die together. It was only once they left the military and went back into the politicized environment that things became separate again, which is so sad. But the military has never been that way. And I think through my initial time in basic trainings, and I went to a lot of basic trainings. So if you consider Navy boot camp, going and training with the Marines, that was a boot camp in and of itself. Coming back, crossing over into the Army and going through their officer candidate school, which is another type of boot camp, right? There were all different races, especially when I was enlisted. It was just so vast. Different standards, different educational standards. It was crazy. But at the same time, it was absolutely beautiful that we could all come together and find harmony and work together towards a common mission. So it saddens me that this occurred, and really it was not known. I didn't know that this training was pushed to you guys. I was already out by that time. I had no idea that it became so politicized right away, and that is absolutely wrong, because the benefit of the military is to remain neutral. Our goal is just to accomplish the mission of the Commander-in-Chief and the Congress and what they order us to do. We don't have to play that political game while we're in.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I joined under Clinton, served under Bush, Obama, Trump, and I never felt the political. I understand 3- and 4-star, flag and general officers are effectively political appointees. I understand that. They get Senate confirmed level. I never felt politics until Joe Biden became president, and it was wild. It was wild. We had people. We lived all over the place. I remember we lived in Kentucky, and I couldn't pronounce the names of my children's classmates. She wanted to do her Valentine's. I couldn't pronounce her name, so I said, "Do your best."
Yeah.
And we moved to Hawaii, and it was a totally different level, kind of diverse culture over there. All these different places we lived, my children were exposed to different races and different upbringings and all these things. And certainly the people that I worked with came from all over. Most of the people, it was very rare for me to meet people from Idaho, where I grew up.
Yeah.
Very rare. So it was always exciting when I did, because we could talk about Boise State football or something like that. But,
yeah.
I think that was a missed opportunity. It was a tragedy that politics in, and I don't really want to bring politics into this, but that was just kind of the nature of my experience, and I think a lot of people experience something similar.
Yeah, John, I appreciate you sharing it, and this is a non-political channel in so many ways. I have my own personal feelings about things, but what I often discuss is the right and the wrong. If we look through history, fascist governments where they do the pulse check, and if anybody doesn't agree with everything they're saying, then you're in trouble or even you're imprisoned. And that is a dangerous precedent to set. And I say that the same to be true with our current president. If he were to instigate anything similar within the military to check the pulse to see if people are aligned with his politics, I would say that to me is as much anger, gets me angry as anything else, because we ought not do that. Soldiers, Marines, Navy, Airmen, Coast Guard all follow orders, and we just move out. We don't have to play that game. So, man, I'm so glad you told me that, but woo, that gets me heated, boy.
Yeah. So let me grab a book really quick, just right here.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. Yeah, talk to me
So I
about
was
some of
reading-
what
I've
you're
been reading
involved
this
in.
book called-
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go.
Say again?
Yeah, I said talk to me about
So
some
I've
of
been
what
reading
you're
this book
involved in.
called-
Yeah.
Yeah, so The Slight Edge, which is not about grief. I don't know if you read this book. It's a great book.
No.
I read it a handful of times. And I was reading this portion the other day, and it pertains to grief recovery. And it was cool to read it outside of the context of that. So let me just read this little portion. It says, each and incomplete thing in your life or work exerts a draining force on you, sucking the energy of accomplishment and success out of you as surely as fire stealing your blood. Every incomplete promise, commitment, or agreement saps your strength because it blocks your momentum and chokes off your ability to progress, or improve. Here's the unfortunate and powerfully destructive truth about being incomplete. It keeps the past alive. And a surefire way of being forced prisoner of your past is to not complete things. So completion is a word that we use when we talk about grief. Towards the end of the COVID pandemic, we would be at home and COVID would come up, because it always comes up, or always came up. And I feel like my children would start, running away. They're like, oh no, dad's on his soapbox again. And one day my wife said to me, John, you need to get therapy about this COVID thing. Unfortunately, I'd already done grief recovery work around my relationship with her, which sounds confusing maybe, but it's the most important relationship I have was the one with her. And while it was a very good relationship, it was an opportunity for me to find the emotional incompletion with her. And so when I heard a message from her, it was received as an expression of love and not attack. Whereas previously I would have experienced that as an attack. Oh, she's attacking me. She thinks I have a problem. I'm broken or something like that. Instead, I just experienced it as she cares for me. She wants me to be happy. Not that, hey, you're messing with her. No, you have some incompletion here. And so I did go to a therapist. And in the end, I realized that, oh, wow, I actually have these tools. I'm a grief recovery specialist through the Grief Recovery Institute. And I have a set of tools that I can use. And usually I use those around relationships with people, my father, with my wife, with even coworkers in the military, stuff like that. I don't engage with them, but it's all stuff that I do internally. And then I realized I can use these tools around the Navy's response to COVID. And so one day I said, okay, honey, give me a few hours. I'm going to go through this process. I went to a room in the house and I went through this process. And I think a symbol that we use is like a burner where you have a steam kettle. And that would have been all the way up at a 10, like at high, as hot as it could go. Like I would get so fired up about COVID and COVID policy and et cetera. And I didn't really want that, but that was just how it was. And I thought, well, this is just the hand I've been dealt. This is how I'm going to live my life until somehow it fades away and something else comes along. And I didn't want that incompletion. And so I went through these steps, and I was frankly astonished at the effect that it had on me. Because instead of being at a 10 or on high, it moved down to a low. I don't know if it was completely off, but it was really close to being off. So I hadn't forgotten the facts or the facts as I perceived them, but the emotional energy around that was basically gone. And so that's why I say this extremism stand down, I don't really want to feel hot about it anymore. I want to let the emotions fade away so that I can move forward. And I think of these various people that we've met, these soldiers that you've worked with, moving from one deployment to a new deployment, that you hoped that would happen during that deployment. You had these hopes, these dreams, these expectations about how your coworkers are going to treat you, how your mission is going to go, etc. And then you realize that things aren't going to go that way. At some point during your deployment, and you realize those things didn't happen. And and you're just left really kind of hollow. Maybe you have regrets, and you carry forward to your next deployment, or take them back to your family, and all these feelings that you had, your coworkers, the other soldiers and sailors, all of a sudden your family members become those people that mistreated you, and you take it out on them. Or this new civilian job that you have, you feel like, this is how my boss was in the Army or in the Navy or whatever. This is how my boss is going to treat me here. And I felt that when I started my civilian job that I've been working in since March, the week or so before I started getting all these feelings. Oh, this is how my boss is going to treat me, or how my coworkers aren't going to understand me, and we're going to have this rift. And I thought, this is not to start a new relationship with a new employer. And so again, I pulled these tools in and I used them, and aside so much grief, I would say, unresolved grief, uncompleted emotional anguish, and I just was able to a new relationship with this new employer with a clean slate, and let these people be who they are, let this employer be who it is, and it doesn't have anything to do with positive or negative experiences in the Navy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. When we talk emotional work, there's so much that I talk about with veterans, first responders, or anybody who's gone through trauma on this channel. and that will be the focus going forward for the rest of the time I do this work on this channel with people, because that emotional work needs to be done. And I'll share a quick story. When I was deployed to Iraq, as an example, I came across a peer's email. It was left open on his computer, and he said some really harsh things about me. And my reaction in the infantry, I marched down the stairs. There was a conference going on with the battalion commander. I opened up that door and I said, "You in the hall." And the commander looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "I need that guy in the hall now." And so the guy got up, left the room. Everybody poured out of the conference room because I think they knew what was about to happen. And I threw him up against the wall and I threatened his immortal soul. Like I was still at a 10 in a combat environment. And that's how I solved that problem. I said, I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to see anything ever again, or else X, Y, and Z. And the battalion commander said, "Are you finished?" And I said, "I am." And they went back into the meeting and it continued. And that was normal for combat arms to do stuff like that. A little bit crazy. So transition into civilian world. I had a boss who I learned was taking credit for my work with his VP of operations. And so I confronted my boss, and he decided he wanted to yell at me. Not a good call. I still was in that same mindset. And so I slammed my hands on his desks and I put my fingers in his face and I said, "I didn't yell at you. You don't yell at me. This will never happen again." I lost that job, surprisingly. Because emotionally, in a civilian environment, you can't solve things like that. And I realized that, wow, in as much as I've done so much work, I wasn't done. Because that type of behavior it's just not acceptable outside of, war, really.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think a lot about our people that are soldiers and sailors that transition out of the military, even if they had a wonderful experience all the way through and they had everything that they wanted. It's such a substantial trend into civilian world. The culture is different, but there was a period when I was out of the Navy when we lived in Kentucky, and I loved working for GE. Was a good experience. I really appreciated my coworker. The GE treated us well, and they respected the the veterans, but there was something that just wasn't quite as exciting about dishwashers and copper wire and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel existentially important compared to what we were doing in the military. And maybe that was irrational, but I don't know. I think you understand where I'm coming from.
100%.
It's just doesn't feel as important. However, not that we don't need dishwashers. We just got a new dishwasher, and it was really tedious for that week when we didn't have one. And so I'm grateful for those things. But from an employer, when you go from the military and you go to whatever it is, whatever widget you're doing, even this, and I think that's probably why you do this kind of work, is you want to feel that sense of mission, you want to give back. And I feel like that's why my wife and I are involved in grief recovery, is because, and in grief recovery, we help everybody under the sun. We're happy to help anybody. Certainly grateful to work with any veteran or family member of a veteran. But transitions, really, grief comes from any change, any positive change, any negative change. And I think grief is kind of misunderstood. Grief can only come from bad things. Well, grief comes from any change in our lives. It's the conflicting feelings that come from any change of pattern of behavior or end. And so what is more profound than leading whether it's 5 years or 25 years in the military, completely changing? That's a huge. And you're going to feel these emotions. I mean, not projecting, but based on my experience, and I think probably on yours too, Michael, you're going to experience a lot of things. You're grateful to be out. You're grateful to have served. But also, did I do enough? Did I do what I was supposed to do? Was I the person that I should have been? And how am I going to carry that forward? And so those are the things that we like to really help people work through. And it's really rewarding for us.
Yeah, and I would add, John, that I've started the process with you, and we had a good first session, and I was a little bit surprised at how strong my emotions were in that session. I talked about my mother passing at a young age, and my best friend who was a civil affairs NCO who took his own life. And those were, I didn't realize, I'd done a lot of processing with those events previously, but it still was pretty heavy emotional experience for me to share those things. And I think the work that you're engaged in helping people to find this recovery, resiliency, hope aligns so much with what I'm doing. And we've got a couple minutes left of this interview, John, but after the interview, stay on, and I want to share something with you, an idea. But the last couple minutes here, John, will you share some advice with people who are listening, and from a global perspective too, for people who are currently struggling emotionally? What would you tell them?
That's a good question. So I guess what I would think is, I think it's really helpful to think about what grief is. Grief is natural reaction to loss of any kind. And it's those conflicting feelings that come from a change or end of a normal pattern of behavior. I think that's actually very helpful to just kind of be aware of that. And those changes could be a child moving out. You're happy they're going to college, or they're doing whatever they're doing, moving on to that next step. But you're also kind of heartbroken because they're leaving the nest. My daughter-in-law just had a baby. We're grandparents. We've been about 10 weeks ago. And he's the sweetest little, but is she only allowed to, or my son, are they only allowed to feel happy things because they have this little boy? Well, they feel all of the emotion. They feel it's challenging. Our lives have changed, and they will never be the same again. And the word that we use grief to describe that. And sometimes just being aware that, this is grief can be very, very, very helpful, so that you can identify it, and then you can kind of maybe take a little bit of a step back and say, okay, this is happening to me. And then you can actually anticipate it in yourself. For instance, when I retired from the Navy, every member of my family was undergoing substantial transitions, big time transitions. And we knew that was coming. And so we really thought a lot about how is this going to affect us emotionally. And I think we came through it very well. But I think just being aware that, hey, these changes are happening and I'm a lot of powerful emotions. So maybe that's not the best advice, but I think it can be helpful just kind of being aware, anticipating in yourself, in love, and just being there. People, when they're grieving, when they're mourning, they don't actually really want advice, typically. They're reaching out from their heart to yours, and they just want your heart to respond. We often use the term, we're a heart with ears and no mouth. And so oftentimes, when you're supporting those around you that are experiencing emotional challenge, you can just be that heart with ears, and you can just express, hey, I'm here for you. I love you. Let me, I'm really sorry. And just that emotional support. That place where they want some advice, you can move into that advice stage.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I remember the first session we did where you mentioned something along those lines about how you talk to somebody who's going through some grief, or especially when it's the death of a loved one. And a guy I interviewed here who was a firefighter in New York just lost his mother over the weekend, and I really had to think, what do I say? Because I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I want him to know that I feel for him in his grief right now. And so I said something along the lines of, my heart and my thoughts and prayers are with you and your family, or something along those lines, and I'm here for you, brother. And that's it, right? Like, I hope that was enough to let him know that I remember him and know that it's challenging. But Jon, you've shared so much with us today that is so good. Thank you for joining us, for sharing your story, for educating me on things that I didn't even know occurred, and for being a stalwart member of our community who continues to help people to progress, which I absolutely love. And I thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's been really great. If anybody wants to learn a little bit more about what we're doing, our website is mendmyheart.org. You can learn more about what we're doing. And if you want to learn whether grief recovery might be for you, there's a place to reach out and contact us. And that would be really great. I'd love to meet with any of you. So thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah, thanks.